This passage is about China and the Chinese interference or support, Chinese intervention in the Korean War, the war between North and South Korea. In October 1950, Chinese troops under the name of Chinese People's Volunteer Army crossed the Yalu River to assist North Korean armies and engaged in the Korean War in an offensive manner after the US troops crossed the 38th parallel. One central question, not the Korean War, it's more about US Korea, right? The Korean War. And one central question immediately arises with regard to the Chinese interventions. After the US troops crossed the 38th parallel, Chinese troops went and assisted North Korea. One central question arises with regard to the Chinese intervention. Why did the newly established PRC decide to send its troop to engage in a war that was not even taking place in its territory? Territory is China. China's new government is there. They've sent troops to Korea. The issue is amazingly puzzling when one considers the fact that the economy of the PRC was in shatters. Chinese economy was in shatters. High inflation, extremely tight fiscal budget, and the lack of material resources. The internal security and authority of the regime was under threat by various acts of sabotage undertaken by remaining KMT agents, and the enemy China faced was far stronger in terms of military equipment and logistical supply. All these reasons went against Chinese intervention in the Korean War. The moment the US crossed the 38th parallel from South to North Korea, it has moved. China sent its troops. Why did it do that? Its economy was in shambles, its internal security was not good, it faced an opponent which was far mightier than it in both military equipment and logistical supply. Still, why did it send its army across? It should be noted that the Chinese Communist Party was preparing for the battles in Taiwan to unify the whole of China. All these conditions added to the puzzle. In general, the conditions were highly unfavorable for an intervention operation. Most scholars like Alan Whiting and Hao Yufan argue that the reason for the Chinese intervention was mainly the security concern of a possible US invasion of Chinese territory. Now, the fact that US crossed the 38th parallel to go to North Korea, China was worried, are we the next target? That is why they probably intervened in the war. Others like Sergei Goncharov and John Lewis put more emphasis on the influence of individual leaders like Mao Zedong. Mao was a very charismatic individual leader. Maybe their influence was what caused the practical part of it. They were not bothered. They just said, cool. So their analysis seems spot on in hindsight. On 25th June 1950, the North Korean army led by Kim Seok-sung launched an offensive against South Korea. Although newly emerged evidence indicates that there was an exchange of views between Kim, Mao, and Stalin on the North's plan of military invasion, several signs indicate that China was still not prepared for an invasion. One example would be that the CCCP started a large campaign of demobilization of the PLA 5 days before the outbreak of the conflict. So, though Mao and Stalin and the North Korean head talked about, had a meeting, evidence shows that China was not prepared for this invasion of North Korea against South Korea, where the US helped South Korea and China helped North Korea. No, the background, the context is being set. But China was still not prepared for the invasion. How do you know China was not prepared for this invasion? One example would be that the CCCP started a large campaign of demobilization of PLA 5 days before the outbreak of a campaign. You would mobilize your troops. Why would you demobilize your troops before a conflict? That means they were not prepared for the conflict. So 1.4 million of the PLA was supposed to be demobilized. As a result, the border area near the Yalu River was left with only one army unit, which was stationed there for crop production purposes. So the reason they had one army unit there, they demobilized most of their troops. That one unit was just kept there for crop production purposes. At the same time, the domestic situation, especially the economic one, was not favorable for an intervention. Agricultural production fell by 40% compared to the pre-civil war years, while major industrial outputs fell by more than 50%. Moreover, military expenditure was cut together with a large campaign of demobilization mentioned above. It's mentioned that less than 10% of the budget was allocated to the militaries in the northeast region in 1950. With other problems. So China, you see, was beset by problems. Other problems include high inflation rate, remaining anti-communist forces of local bandits which sought to establish their own authorities, and KMT agents. The situation seemed highly unfavorable for armed intervention. In fact, at the initial stage, China took a passive response to the situation. In the initial stages of the conflict, China was passive. In North Korea, besides moral support for Kim, the only material support, they only give moral support. The only material support they give was provided by Beijing at the time to send approximately 14,000 Korean Chinese. No, not Chinese native. They sent Korean Chinese who were then serving in PLA back to Korea. This is the only material support they gave. This is the passage in short. Why, according to the scholars, did China participate in the Korean War? Puzzle. It had economic problems, financial, every kind of problems. Why did it take part in the war? It said two reasons, right? One is that it was afraid that America might attack China next. Other may be due to influential individual leaders. And then he says this analysis, the second analysis, seems to be spot on in hindsight when you think back, to address concerns of American aggression and because of the influence of individual Chinese leaders. A gives both the reasons perfectly. So our correct answer is A.